And I'll turn it over to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
We're good.
Okay, and can you see the screen?
We're good in that count too.
All right, look at us winning over here. Thank you for that really warm and kind introduction. Just from being a fly on the wall, you all sound like a pretty fun bunch. So we've got to like come out there and hang with you and have some tasty happy hour snacks. But I will bring you back into the seriousness of this space. Our work is pretty exciting. My name is Dooney Cozy-Gay. I'm the director of the Preservation Compact, and we are a research and policy collaborative housed at the Community Investment Corporation, which is a CDFI here in Chicago that does a lot of multifaceted work in addition to their multifamily lending. We're rooted in preserving affordable rental housing, and we have three critical components of our work. One is around training, one is around lending, and my work, which is around policy and research. And I'm going to turn it over to our partner, Jeff, to introduce the work that he does and how we work together. Jeff?
Thanks, Dooney, and good, I believe it's afternoon in California. It's currently afternoon. It's been afternoon for a minute here in Chicago, but good afternoon, everybody. Jeff Smith, I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Housing Studies at DePaul University. We are an applied research center based in the business school at DePaul, and we produce a lot of different types of research and data products to help inform different types of housing policy development and program development in neighborhoods across Chicago. And one of the key things that we do is really collaborate with groups like the Preservation Compact to connect our research and data to their questions. And this project that we're going to talk about today is a pretty exciting example of what that collaboration looks like.
Thanks for that, Jeff. So before we dive into our topic, I guess we can try this in Zoom, but a show of raised hands if you all know what we mean when we say NOAA. Looks like, okay, good. And so I always feel compelled to just contextualize, because I think it's just very important to make sure everyone's on the same page and understands it the way that we are looking at it. But naturally occurring affordable housing refers to the existing housing that is affordable because of its location, size, age, market, doesn't use government subsidies, and most importantly, it manages to still keep rents affordable despite not having government subsidies. But it's really important because it makes up 70% of the affordable housing stock that is being lost, and there's an increasing movement to drive efforts to preserve this valuable housing stock. So our work is very much focused in that space. We also look at some subsidized housing, but we'll touch on that very gently as we want to keep the focus on NOAA. And so just in giving you our definition of what NOAA is, I'm sure right away the mind goes to what kind of strategies do you use to even approach this space? And I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to give you some insights as to how we're approaching this space.
So one of the, so we're based in Chicago, and a lot of our work is focused on understanding this issue in Chicago, which I'm sure is in many, many ways different than the market context in Chicago, at least is different than the context in San Mateo County. But in Chicago, one of the key ways that we've tried to understand the NOAA market and the pressures on the NOAA supply is through understanding the underlying market context, which connects in many ways to the pressures on the stock and the strategies to support and preserve the stock. So, for example, in higher cost neighborhoods, these are neighborhoods that are either existing, expensive, or have rapidly rising prices. There's a different set of strategies that might be around preserving rents in the NOAA stock is affordable. Some of the strategies, as Dooney noted, are devoted to working with existing building owners to control costs that might be related to energy or utility costs or rising property taxes, creating different types of incentives that might relate to putting a deed restriction or some type of restriction on the rents that might be charged by giving them an incentive like low cost financing or property tax relief, protecting the existing stock. One of the phenomena we've seen in Chicago, for example, is you have a lot of NOAA in small rental properties, like 2 to 4 unit buildings, 2 flats. Those are under a lot of pressure in these higher cost areas because there's a lot of demand for really expensive single family homes or really expensive condo buildings. So how do you work with existing owners of those 2 flats to sort of mitigate any pressure they might face and preserve that stock as rental as opposed to the market incentive, which might be to sell that property to a developer to convert it into a higher cost non-rental property. So that's higher cost areas and a more distressed, historically disinvested, lower cost markets, which we also have a lot of in Chicago. The emphasis is a little different. It's not so much an issue related to preventing or mitigating rent increases. It's more on preserving the existing stock and making sure that the stock is in good condition. And this, relates to ensuring that building owners have access to different types of financial products that might help them invest in the maintenance of their property. Similarly, costs are costs, and if you have a more maybe limited ability to raise rents or offset rising costs with rising rents, it's even more important to invest in strategies to control those costs. So similarly, energy efficiency and property tax strategies are important in lower cost markets as well. And then there's other strategies, especially around cultivating a pipeline of owners who are more, let's say, mission oriented, maybe less profit motivated, who are interested in investing in these lower cost neighborhoods and understanding some of the potential nuances or challenges of owning and managing properties in these areas and keeping them affordable.
Thanks for that, Jeff. So as you can see, quite a bit comes out of that space. I thought it would be helpful for you to just get a sense of what we're doing and what's born out of this joint work. So we have property tax incentives that we've created, just had an omnibus bill pass a year ago for the state of Illinois to offer a little bit of relief for the NOAA owners and multifamily housing properties that are 7+ unit, that have 7+ units. We offer, we take our research and figure out low cost financing structures and then do a warm handoff to our CDFI and or other financial entities to help them figure out how they channel their resources. Zoning and building code reforms. So we're looking at things, ways that we can increase the housing stock. One of the things that we're doing is around accessory dwelling units. Rental assistance. If you all haven't touched that, you all live in an island, that work I think has touched everyone because of the current state and post I'll say emergency state that we were in. The targeted code enforcements that we've made have also yielded some really positive results. And our interagency coordination, it's important to note some of what Jeff just mentioned. We bring together entities from a variety of government agencies, community advocacy groups, so they can talk to each other about ways that they can streamline efforts, be more efficient in their work together, but most importantly, to find ways to preserve those affordable units that might be at risk of being lost if say the owner doesn't renew their contract, or try to find responsible owners to take over the contract if, say, an owner is tapped out and says, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. So we really try to use that interagency coordination to do just that, coordinate for the purpose to save very valuable affordable units. So the Preservation of the Compact is no stranger to this work. Along with the Institute for Housing Studies, we embarked on a journey to really understand, as Jeff mentioned, the pressures of NOAA, and really understand the supply and demand and what it would mean to preserve existing affordable rental housing. So housing that's not supported by government subsidy or regulatory agreements, is a pretty new idea. I think it around 11 years or so that that term was coined. And so the research conducted has really given us some perspective, and we created what we call our NOAA clearinghouse, that includes studies on the characteristics of NOAA properties, their location, their distribution, their role in providing affordable housing options, and the challenges that they face in terms of preservation, renovation, and long-term affordability. So this research study that Jeff is going to talk a little bit about in our next few slides really does align well with the history of the work that we've been doing together to understand this space.
Yeah, so as Dooney mentioned, we've been working together in Chicago for a number of years to try to wrap our minds around a lot of issues related to the NOAA housing stock, convening owners, community residents, community groups, policy groups, to understand, financial institutions, to understand the various nuances of this housing type and how to preserve it. But that's Chicago. And through other conversations with folks working in other cities or with folks working nationally, it emerged that there might be a need for talking across cities potentially to understand what other folks are doing in this space. Because Chicago, we've done a lot of work on this issue, but maybe other folks haven't had the same experience or haven't talked about it in the same way or have done it some work, but maybe we could learn from what they're doing in their cities. So there seems to be an opportunity to create some type of data lens to understand what NOAA markets might look like in other cities across the country, and then use that lens to talk about the various challenges in these different market contexts. So the project that we're working on is really pull together a bunch of data to categorize broad metropolitan regions based on their NOAA characteristics and housing affordability characteristics, use these typologies to convene and engage stakeholders representing similar and different NOAA market contexts to learn about what they're doing or what some of their challenges might be, and then to create this central resource guide and repository of NOAA preservation that documents these different strategies and can inform future work on the space. And Dooney, if you could move the slide to the next one here. Thanks. And so what is it that we are producing through this project? We're working with the Preservation Compact to put together this data, put together some advisory groups, talk to different stakeholders in the space, and develop that policy framework. And I think this is where you guys come in. I think we were invited to talk to you about what we're doing. I know, but honestly, I think one of the things that we hope to get out of this meeting is to learn from you as well, because as noted, we know Chicago, we know what's going on in Chicago, but I don't know anything about San Mateo. So curious to learn more about sort of what your perspectives are on this issue. And we've got a few questions that we were hoping to ask, and I'll turn it over to Dooney to kind of lay that out.
And apologies, Jeff. My mouse is in murky waters, and so the delay is a real thing. Sorry. But yes, so questions to consider. We're interested in general feedback. I mean, because this is a national discussion, it's so appropriate that we get to be here with you today to just hear what's going on in your neck of the woods, and to just share ideas. I know we have a very limited window of time to discuss, but let's open the floor. I'll stop sharing the screen, and I can drop the questions in the chat and just kind of move through them. But I think we have enough time to, gently touch on each, or at the very least, just hear feedback and see how the wheels are turning. We are curious to know what NOAA looks like in San Mateo County. What are some of the key pressures, and how does the variety and market type inform your approach? And how can our project support the work that you're doing to enhance or inform those outcomes? And recognizing that I believe it was deed restriction, right? That was being considered as a tool. And then what are some other models you are exploring in your region that have actually worked? So I'll pause there and stop sharing so that we can have a dialogue. And I take
I'll-
no
I'll
questions.
jump in
Oh, go
with
for it.
what immediately came to mind for me from some of the work the county has done in the past was in the past we have taken on a couple of projects where there was a NOAA complex, pretty old, with a lot of low income renters living in it, and have opted to purchase that, preserve that, bring it up to the repairs that are needed, and then preserve that so that those rents are going to continue to be affordable for those low income tenants going forward. I think the challenges we have had there, which are not unique in any way, is just that from the public subsidy perspective, our housing dollars go much further if we are using tax credits to build new housing, to fund the new housing development of affordable housing rather than preserving existing affordable housing. It's just much more expensive on a per unit level.
Just to confirm, so it's more expensive to preserve using tax credits than to build new?
So I'm not an expert in affordable housing finance, but I think part of the problem is that the path for using tax credits for preservation is a lot more complicated. It's not as straightforward. And so there are narrower opportunities there. So you end up just spending a lot more, whereas you can achieve much greater leverage with your dollars when you're doing new construction of affordable housing.
Gotcha. And I'm curious, for this particular development, how did you get connected to the owner? Was it an existing relationship? Was it a market opportunity? Was there, because that's one of the issues that we've seen in the NOAA space, is that the market moves quickly, right? A lot of folks out there, the cash buyers, whatnot, can swoop in, and tax credits, like you said, are complex, take a long time to pull it all together. So I'm imagining there was some type of existing relationship or some type of opportunity that presented itself there.
I think it may have come about through relationships with the local CBOs who are really connected to tenants in a particular area of our unincorporated county called North Fair Oaks. So I think that's probably how it came about, and those CBOs being in close contact with the supervisor who represents that area.
Thank you. That's really helpful, because that is one of the issues I think that, at least locally, that we see, and I think it's a strategy that seems to bubble up in lots of places, is how do you get control of the property and keep it affordable? And it's the acquisition point, I think, where there's the financing side, and there's also the acquisition point that are challenging. So it's good to hear just an example of how that might look in San Mateo. I'm going to put a question out there that going to look silly. This is always a risk when talking to people in other places, but I saw there was a discussion of TOD, transferring to development ordinance. And I'm curious if there is any, and if there's sort of how this type of housing is considered, if it is at all considered around, transferring to development context. Chicago just recently passed a TOD ordinance, and one of the components among many was related to requiring I mentioned this issue of conversions of 2 flats and 2 to 4 unit buildings into single family homes as being one of the drivers of lost affordability. And one of the components of the TOD ordinance was to restrict that type of downzoning. So it's not a by right type of activity, that it required a zoning change that would slow down or be an impediment to that type of deconversion, so to speak. And I'm curious, if that's an issue that comes up in TOD related conversations in San Mateo.
So California law prevents, in theory, not all restrictions follow, remember this, but going from multi-units to single family. So that might help a little bit.
A lot.
Does everyone remember that? It's like this provision in there. I think sometimes there's so many California housing rules. Anyway,
Right.
I think it's an issue that sometimes the value of single family homes is greater than that of a duplex.
But even outside, I guess outside, I mean, that's sort of a Chicago thing, the single family question. I'm guessing other related affordability. Again, I know California's got a whole set of laws that I don't know anything about, so it could be that this is old hat for you guys. I'm just kind of curious though, transit access as an amenity of sorts. You know, that's how that's considered in different TOD types of legislation.
I think at least, so I work for a city that about 50% of the housing stock is rental, and most of that is naturally occurring affordable. So we have been really interested in what we can do. The bigger threat, I would say, is not converting to single family, but change of ownership, and then improvements to the property, which they are older, so they need some improvement, but that's also then when the rents go up significantly. So there'll be a kind of shock between the old mom and pop property owner and a new investor owner who just, and then, you know, people end up moving out. And the city has been looking into different financial models to whether to start buying some of these themselves, which is expensive. So I'll be interested to see the financing kind of suggestions, that if the city can maybe facilitate something but not actually own the buildings, or do, you know, something that does leverage the money a little better than, you know, one thing we've looked at is buying buildings but then financing them so that, you know, you're not paying the full cost in cash. But so it's definitely something we're working on right now, and just trying to figure out. But that would be the objective, is when the turnover happens, to control rents from going up higher. The other thing is, this may be a thing you'll want to look at in California with Proposition 13. The property tax equation may be different than in other states, and I think property tax relief could be helpful, but we don't get the reassessments other states have. It's pretty fixed.
Thanks for that, Kevin. That's good to know.
I actually had a quick question. Is there any specific data that we should parse out related to mobile home parks as well? In East Palo Alto, we have 2 mobile home parks. One that is officially is closing and probably going to get redeveloped, and then another that just recently converted from rental to for sale. Although that conversion isn't fully complete. One of the similar things that was brought up earlier was that the owners of the mobile home coaches would like to band together to purchase, and you know, need to get to a certain threshold before it is a fully converted condoized mobile home park. So just wondering if data can be parsed out there in particular, according to the housing type as well, and mobile homes with a unique situation.
So that's an interesting question. I don't know that I can address mobile homes specifically, or mobile home parks specifically. I'd be curious. You know, it's not a housing type that is common in Chicago, but you know, just thinking from an administrative data perspective, you know, it is interesting to you know, noting, I think Kevin's point too on turnover, and I think some folks have mentioned that turnover in general is a risk. Looking at the length of ownership of like you know, to identify likely NOAA owners based on how long a parcel has been owned continuously by the same entity could potentially create some type of universe of where those market rate low cost rental units exist, and potentially inform some outreach. This doesn't answer your question, I don't think, around mobile homes specifically, but I'm thinking just around you know, kind of who owns that and what some of the incentives for turnover might be, especially when there's open land or vacant land, or not vacant necessarily, but land that could have a higher value and a different type of use. You know, thinking about different ways to understand the market context and ownership could be useful, but yeah, interesting question though.
And I also thought about zoning and just the community advocacy efforts that are really driving some of the spaces here to make sure voices are heard and folks are being responsible and responsive in that space. So I'd be curious to see what that looks like as well, because yes, again, it's definitely unique for us based on what our market looks like, but has me incredibly curious. Additionally, as part of one of the groups in our cohort is actually looking at a model that's similar to what you were talking about, the community of residents buying and taking ownership of the property, and they might be worth following up with just to see the variety of housing types that they're looking at. And I can pass that information along to Joshua at a later time. Well, okay, I'm gonna call it.
I'll add one thing before we go too. So
Oh,
one way
please,
this is the conversations have been coming up too is affirmatively furthering for fair housing, which California law has now been pushing cities to really think about. And I think there's been this real part of that, lots of pieces to it, but one of the concerns of that is the displacement aspects of rezoning that with the transit-oriented development. And then like balancing that with the climate aspects of not having the transit, or like there's so many pieces going on, but a lot of the housing around a lot of the transit hubs are naturally occurring affordable housing. So how do you redevelop those areas without putting too much pressure on that the NOAA? I think it's something we're all struggling with. We think we'll continue to look for ideas to address it.
I'll just have one more if we have a sec. That could be an option. Again, it's kind of a uniquely Californian. A lot of these older buildings are also seismically vulnerable. They'll have these kind of big open parking levels on the ground floor, and then the units are above. And so here we've been looking at, if the city were to provide financial support to an owner to do the seismic retrofit in exchange for keeping the rents stabilized for a certain amount of time. I don't know if there would be any takers, but that could be another option for a kind of indirect subsidy and protect, as opposed to have the buildings taken down if they have to do a seismic retrofit.
It sounded, I think you said at the beginning, you're talking about typologies, or thinking about how you're going to develop those for different types of market conditions. And the general tension that I think is, that we kind of deal with is just that all the jurisdictions here in the Bay Area and through much of California now in our current housing element cycle, which we're just entering our obligation for the number of new units that we need to produce in the next 8-year cycle has increased threefold. And so there's just a really big need for us to produce a ton more housing at all income levels. And that often, unfortunately, is just in conflict in various ways, or there's a tension with preserving existing housing and preserving existing NOAAs. And in some senses, because they often occur around like transit or in areas that are really otherwise may be ideal for upzoning and for significant new redevelopment. So I just think it's important to think of it in terms of that larger continuum of housing and how it has to sort of work with the need to just produce a lot more housing because we've underbuilt for so many decades.
That's very interesting. Yeah, the policy lens that that to apply to a typology is really, and I don't know that we'll be able to do that with the data that we have, but it is sort of a post-analysis type thing where you kind of look at the different policy context within these different markets. But yeah, California is interesting, and I hadn't even thought about the issue that you just raised. So the idea, just so I'm clear, is you've got older, maybe less dense housing that is redevelopable, let's say, into higher density housing, and that puts pressure on the loss of that lower cost housing. And there's no, is there like a requirement of affordability in a new development, or is it sort of a?
And yeah, in a lot of places there are like inclusionary requirements. So if you're replacing a couple lots of single family or duplexes or whatever with a big new apartment building, you might get a lot more affordable units out of that. But it's still displacement, and it's still a tension that we have to deal with.
I'm curious, one of the issues that we've noted is that a lot of older housing, especially in like smaller 2 flats and such, are often larger units, so multiple bedrooms. And the newer housing tends to be oriented towards smaller households, and especially in new construction, if it's inclusionary, the developers are less inclined to, set aside in the building at least, family sized units. I'm curious if there's any requirements in California to include a mix of unit sizes and such, in these new developments.
Just if you're demolishing affordable larger housing, you have to match it with the same number of bedrooms. So however many units you destroyed, you do have to replace.
Got it. Coming in Chicago, where there was like a plan for transformation where you demolished a bunch of public housing and theoretically replacing it with housing in the future. I'm curious how this all plays out. But yeah, it sounds like definitely a important type of policy to track. So thanks for sharing that.
Definitely logical. Well, thank you so much, Joshua, for having us. It's always, a pleasure to meet new people who are fighting the good fight and learning about what's happening in other spaces. We are absolutely available to follow up to keep the conversation going. So please feel free to find us, send us a note. Joshua knows where we are. And as the information kind of sets in, just, we're happy to follow up with you. Jeff, I don't know if you have any parting words.
I do not, other than thank you.
Great, thanks. Can you guys, I don't think we have a copy of the presentation. Do you guys mind sending that after the meeting?
Absolutely.
And we'll
Yeah.
post it on 21 Elements website.
Absolutely. We'll send it over.
Great,
Thank you,
thank you very
everybody.
much. Thanks for coming.